The rain had been falling since before dawn, and it showed no signs of mercy by the time Walter Hale rode into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on the 15th day of October, in the year 1878. He had been on the trail for 11 days, driving a small herd of longhorns up from the Texas Panhandle, with two other cowhands who had since parted ways at the edge of town, each man eager for a hot bath and a cold drink. Walter was not opposed to either of those things, but something made him slow his horse, a big buckskin gelding named Copper, to a near standstill at the far end of the main street. He had passed through Caldwell before, a cattle town that sat right on the Kansas border, a rough and lively place that had seen more than its share of trouble. But today the street was mostly empty, driven clear by the cold October rain that turned the dirt to a thick red mud and ran in rivulets along the boardwalks. That was when he saw her. She stood behind a small wooden cart at the edge of the road, just beside the general store, a canvas stretched above her on two thin poles that provided barely any shelter at all. The rain was coming in sideways, driven by a wind that swept down the flat Kansas plains without a single hill to slow it, and she was soaked through to the bone. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks. Her shawl was heavy and dark with water, and yet she stood there, straight and unbowed, with a basket of bread loaves arranged on the cart's wooden surface before her, and not a single customer in sight. Walter slowed Copper to a complete stop and just looked at her for a moment. She was not looking at him. She was looking down the empty street with an expression that was not quite defeat, but was something close to it, something careful and quietly determined, the look of a woman who had made a decision, and intended to see it through regardless of what the sky chose to throw at her. She could not have been older than 24 or 25, and there was a quality to her bearing that told him she was not a woman who made decisions lightly or abandoned them easily. He dismounted, looping Copper's reins around the cart's handle, and walked around to face her properly. She looked up then, and their eyes met for the first time. Hers were a deep, steady brown, with something in them that reminded him of good soil after a rain, rich and dark and patient. She blinked at him, surprised, as if she had not truly expected anyone to stop. "Good morning," she said, in a voice that was clear and composed despite the rain dripping from the end of her nose. "Morning," Walter said. He looked at the bread. It was good bread, he could tell that just from the look of it, round and golden brown, the loaves sitting in neat rows in the basket. "How many have you got?" She glanced down at the basket, counting quickly. 11 loaves, she said, baked fresh this morning, 20 cents apiece. He did not ask the price. He had already reached into his coat pocket. He had $30 on his person from the sale of the cattle, a good portion of which he had already earmarked for new supplies and a few nights' lodging. But the price of 11 loaves of bread at 20 cents each was $2.20, and that was a sum he could manage without thinking twice. He pulled out the coins and counted them into her outstretched hand, which was red from the cold, $2.20 in silver, every cent of it. She stared at the coins in her palm and then looked back up at him. "You have not even tasted it," she said. "I expect it is good," he said simply. "And you have been standing here in this rain a good while by the look of you." Something shifted in her face then, just briefly, a crack in that careful composure that let something warmer and more vulnerable flicker through. Then it closed again, and she began wrapping each loaf in the squares of plain cloth she had folded in the bottom of the basket. "I can carry them," Walter said. "If they're somewhere dry I ought to bring them." She paused. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes and took his measure with the directness of a woman who had learned not to trust too quickly and not to reject too hastily either. Whatever she saw in him seemed to satisfy some internal judgment because she nodded. "The boarding house," she said, 3 blocks east. I keep a room there. Mrs. Calloway runs it." "All right," he said. He gathered the wrapped loaves in the crook of his arm, leaving her the basket. "I am Walter Hale," he said. "I just came up from Texas." "Adelaide Underwood," she said, taking the empty basket and folding the canvas from the poles with practiced efficiency. I have been in Caldwell since June." They walked side by side through the rain, she with her head down and her basket swinging, he with his arm full of bread and Copper's reins in his other hand, the big buckskin walking docilely behind them. It was not a long walk, but it was a cold one, and by the time they reached the boarding house, a two-story clapboard building with a covered porch and a sign that read Calloway's Rooms and Board, Walter was fairly well soaked himself. Mrs. Calloway met them at the door with the expression of a woman who had seen a great many unexpected things in her time and had learned to simply accommodate them. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and a kind enough face if you looked past the brisk efficiency of it. "Adelaide," she said, eyeing Walter with open curiosity. "And who is this?" "Walter Hale," Adelaide said, stepping inside and shaking the water from her shawl. "He bought all the bread." "Did he now?" Mrs. Calloway said, with the particular tone of a woman who was filing that information away for later examination. Walter set the loaves on the table inside the door and turned his hat in his hands. "I ought to see to my horse," he said. "Is there a livery stable nearby?" "Henderson's," Mrs. Calloway said. "Back 2 blocks, left at the barber, can't miss it." He nodded, and he was turning to go when Adelaide said, "Mr. Hale." He turned back. She was holding out 2 of the loaves. "Take these with you. You paid for them, and you will need to eat." He opened his mouth to protest and then thought better of it, because the look on her face told him that she was not offering out of charity. She was offering out of fairness. He took the loaves. "Thank you, Miss Underwood," he said. "Thank you," she said, and this time the warmth behind the words was unmistakable. He walked back out into the rain thinking that he did not know much about Adelaide Underwood yet, but he already knew enough to be certain that she was not a woman a man ought to let walk out of his life without at least making an effort. He stabled Copper at Henderson's, paid for 3 days' board and feed, and then spent the better part of an hour finding himself a room at a different lodging house on the main street. He had thought about asking for a room at Calloway's but decided against it, thinking that it might seem forward, and that whatever he had felt standing in that rain-soaked street was something worth approaching carefully, like a skittish horse that deserved patience rather than pursuit. He ate one of the loaves of bread that evening sitting on the edge of his bed with a candle burning on the table beside him, and it was, as he had expected, very good bread. Dense and slightly sweet, with a crust that gave way to a soft interior that tasted of something familiar and comforting, like a home he had not had in a long time. He wrapped the second loaf carefully in his spare shirt and set it aside. He had not had a home in a long time, truthfully. He was 28 years old and had been working cattle since he was 15, following the herds north along the Kisham Trail and west along whatever rough tracks opened up before him, always moving, always in the saddle, sleeping under canvas or under stars. It was a life he had chosen, and one he had not found cause to regret mostly. But there were moments, usually in the quiet of a cold night, when he felt the particular hollowness of a man who was always arriving somewhere and never quite staying. He thought about that as he fell asleep that night, listening to the rain still drumming on the roof. The next morning was clear and bright and cold, the kind of October morning that felt like an apology from the sky for the previous day's behavior. The mud in the streets was beginning to dry at the edges. The town was alive again, wagons moving, boots on the boardwalks, voices carrying in the sharp air. Walter found himself walking in the direction of Calloway's boarding house without having made a conscious decision to do so. Adelaide was in the yard behind the house when he arrived, hanging washing on a line strung between 2 posts. She wore a plain gray dress and a white apron, and her dark hair was pinned up today, neat and tidy, with just one strand falling loose across her cheek. She heard the gate and turned. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice carried something between surprise and what he hoped was pleasure. "Good morning, Miss Underwood," he said, removing his hat. "I wondered if I might return the cloth you wrapped those loaves in." He had, in fact, carefully refolded the 2 squares of plain cloth and carried them here specifically as a reason to come. He held them out. She took them with a small, knowing look that suggested she was not entirely deceived by his excuse, but was willing to accept it at face value. "Thank you for bringing them back," she said. She turned back to her washing. He stayed. After a moment, she glanced at him sideways. "Are you planning to stand there all morning, Mr. Hale?" "I was hoping you might talk to me a while," he said, with the straightforward honesty that had always been his best quality in conversation, if not always his most charming one. She hung a sheet and smoothed it with her palm. "What would you like to talk about?" "You could start with why you were selling bread in the rain," he said. "Because I do not think that was your plan for the morning, and I do not think it was your habit." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might not answer. Then she picked up another sheet from the basket and began working it over the line. "My father built a small bakery here in Caldwell," she said. "He came out from Missouri in '68 when the cattle drive started bringing money into these towns. He built it up over 10 years. It was a good bakery." She smoothed the sheet and did not look at him. "He died in April. Heart gave out one morning while he was loading the oven. He was 53 years old." "I am sorry," Walter said, and he meant it with the full weight of a man who understood loss. "The bakery came to me," she said. "He had no one else. My mother passed when I was 12. I have been running it since May, but it has been difficult. I did not know the supply side as well as my father did, and I made some mistakes early on, ordered too much of the wrong flour, not enough of the right kind. I lost 2 weeks of baking to a spoiled barrel." She finally glanced at him, and there was something very direct and unashamed in her eyes. "I am not telling you this for your sympathy. I am telling you because you asked." "I appreciate that distinction," he said seriously. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. It was brief but genuine, and it transformed her features in a way that made his chest do something uncomfortable. "The street cart is just while I rebuild the inventory," she said. "The bakery itself is on Elm Street. It was closed yesterday because I needed to sell what I had baked and I could not be in 2 places at once." She paused. "It did not occur to me that it would rain." "How long have you been managing on your own?" he asked. 6 months, she said. 6 months. He thought about what that meant. A young woman alone in a cattle town, managing a business, learning as she went, standing in the rain selling bread because she needed every cent and she was not willing to quit. "You managed all right?" he asked carefully. "I have managed," she said, with a precision that told him all right was a more complicated measure than he perhaps understood. He helped her finish hanging the washing, which she accepted without comment and without objection, and when the basket was empty, she invited him inside for a cup of coffee, which he accepted without pretending not to want it. Mrs. Calloway's kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and something savory cooking on the stove. The landlady herself was at the far end, stirring a pot and pretending not to watch them with great interest. Adelaide poured 2 cups from the coffee pot on the stove and set them on the table, and they sat across from each other in the morning light coming through the window, and it was the most comfortable Walter had felt in a very long time. They talked for an hour and a half. He told her about the cattle drive, about Texas, about the long flat miles between one place and another. She told him about Missouri, about growing up in a bakery, learning to read recipes before she learned to read anything else, about the particular satisfaction of watching something simple like flour and water, and a little salt turn into something that could sustain a person through a hard day. "There is something honest about bread," she said, turning her cup in her hands. "It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. It is meant to nourish. That is its whole purpose." "I find that straightforward." He looked at her across the table. "You are a lot like that yourself," he said, and immediately wondered if he had gone too far. But she just looked at him steadily and said, "So are you, I think." For a man who claimed he was only returning laundry cloth. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him because he had not done it in a while, and she smiled fully for the first time, and it was as warm and honest as good bread and just as nourishing. And Walter Hale, who had spent 13 years moving and never staying, felt something in him go absolutely and permanently still. He stayed in Caldwell. It was not a decision he made dramatically or all at once. He simply found, each morning when he woke and thought about moving on, that he did not want to. He extended his stay at the lodging house by another 3 days, and then another week, and he found work quickly enough, because a man who could ride and rope and knew cattle was never without employment in a town that sat at the edge of the cattle trails. He hired on with a local rancher named Declan Prout, who ran a mid-sized operation 6 miles east of town and needed a good hand for the fall work, repairing fences, managing the last of the herd before winter, general work that kept a man busy from before sunrise to after sunset. He visited Adelaide every evening he could manage, which was most evenings. He began stopping by the bakery on Elm Street, which he found on his second full day in town, a modest building with a painted sign above the door that read Underwood's Bakery, the letters slightly faded but still proud. He would come in the late afternoon, when she was finishing the day's baking and cleaning down the counters, and he would sit on the stool she kept near the far end of the counter, and they would talk while she worked. She was not a woman who stopped working just because someone was present. He respected that. He learned the rhythm of her days quickly, that she rose at 4 in the morning to start the ovens, that she made between 6 and 12 loaves a day depending on supplies, that she sold most of it by noon and used the afternoons for bookkeeping and ordering and the various administrative tasks that kept a small business running. "You keep the books yourself?" he asked one afternoon in late October, watching her work through a column of figures in a ledger. "I do," she said, without looking up. "My father did too, which is fortunate because I grew up watching him. I know how it should look." "And how does it look now?" She looked up then, and there was a careful frankness in her expression. "Better than it did in June," she said. "Still not where it needs to be. I have a debt to the flour merchant in Wichita that I am working down, and there was a repair needed to the oven in September that cost more than I expected." She closed the ledger. "But I am not behind, Mr. Hale. I want you to know that. I am slow, but I am not behind." "I was not worried that you were," he said honestly. She looked at him for a moment. "Most men in this town, when they hear a woman is running a business alone, assume she must be failing at it. I have grown accustomed to the assumption." "I assumed the opposite," he said. "When I saw you standing in that rain selling bread, I did not think you were failing. I thought you were working." The look she gave him then was one he would remember for a long time, something deep and grateful and carefully guarded, like a fire that a person tends with great attention because they know how much warmth it gives and how much it costs if it goes out. November came, and with it the first real cold of the Kansas winter, the kind of cold that settled into the bones and did not let go. The cattle drives were done for the season. The town quieted considerably, as it always did when the trail season ended and the cowboys dispersed. Walter kept on with Declan Prout's ranch, which had winter work enough to justify keeping one reliable hand on through the cold months. He and Adelaide settled into a pattern that felt, to Walter, like the most natural thing he had ever experienced. He came to the bakery most evenings. On Sundays, when the bakery was closed, she would sometimes walk with him, through the quieter streets of town or along the creek that ran a 1/4 mile east. It was cold walking, but they both seemed to prefer being outside to being cooped up in someone's parlor being watched by Mrs. Calloway, whose interest in their developing acquaintance was warm but not exactly subtle. They talked about everything. He told her about the drives, about the particular loneliness and particular freedom of that life, about men he had worked with and respected, and in some cases outlasted. He told her, carefully and without dramatizing it, about the brother he had lost to a fever on the trail 3 years ago, a younger brother named James who had been working his first season and had not made it through. Adelaide listened, with the focused attention of someone who understood what it cost a person to say such things out loud. She told him about her father, more of it now, the 10 years of building the bakery piece by piece, the pride he had taken in being one of the few businesses in town that had never cheated a customer or turned away someone genuinely hungry. She told him about the hardest months of the summer, about learning to negotiate with suppliers who had not taken her seriously, about the particular challenge of being a young woman alone in a room full of men who were accustomed to doing business with her father and were skeptical that she could fill his place. Did they come around? Walter asked one Sunday afternoon, their breath making small clouds in the cold air as they walked along the creek bank. Some of them, she said, the ones who cared more about good bread than about their assumptions. The others I simply learned to go around. He stopped walking, which made her stop too and look at him. What? She said. I am trying to figure out how to say something without it coming out wrong, he said. She waited, watching him with those steady brown eyes. I think you are the most capable person I have met in a very long time, he said. And I mean that as a plain statement of fact, not flattery. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek, which was running low and quick between its frozen edges. Then she said very quietly, Walter. It was the first time she had used his first name. He felt it like sunlight. I am glad you bought that bread, she said. She still did not look at him. I am glad you stayed. So am I, he said. And then, because he had always been better at doing than at saying, he reached out and took her hand where it hung at her side, and she let him, and they stood there beside the cold creek in the thin November light, holding hands, saying nothing, and it was more than enough. He proposed to her in December, which surprised them both a little with its quickness, though when Adelaide thought about it afterward, she found that it did not feel quick at all. It felt like the natural end point of a conversation they had been having since October, a conversation conducted in bread and coffee and long evenings and cold walks, in the steady accumulation of small truths exchanged between two people who were learning each other with the seriousness that kind of learning deserved. He did it in the bakery, because it was her place, and he wanted her to be somewhere she felt strong. It was a Tuesday evening in early December, the oven still warm from the day's work, the smell of fresh bread in the air. He had thought about it for 3 weeks and had spent one of those weeks building up the nerve, which he would later admit to her was harder than anything he had done on the trail. Adelaide, he said, standing on his side of the counter while she dried her hands on her apron. I know that I'm a man with not much to his name but a horse and a saddle and a solid reputation for honest work, and I know that you are a woman who has built something real here that matters to you and ought to matter to anyone. I am not asking you to give any of it up. I am asking if you would consider whether there is room for me in the life you are building. She had set down the towel very carefully and was looking at him. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. I am asking if you would be willing to, he said. There is a difference. She considered him for a long moment that felt to Walter like at least 3 significant geological ages. Then she said, Is that a difference that matters to you? Very much, he said. Because if you say yes, I want it to be because you want to, not because you felt you had no choice or because you felt you ought to. Walter Hale, she said, and her voice had a warmth in it now that could have heated the room. I have been making my own choices since I was 18 years old, and I have not yet made one that I did not mean. She came around the end of the counter. She was not quite smiling, but her eyes were, that deep warm brown alive with something that he recognized as happiness and was almost undone by. Yes, she said, standing before him. That is my answer, and I mean it. He had bought a ring in Wichita on a day. He had ridden out there on a supply run for the Prout Ranch and had taken a detour on his own account. It was a simple ring, a thin band of silver with a small oval-cut turquoise stone set in it, because he had known instinctively that Adelaide was not a woman for complicated ornamentation, and the stone was the color of the Kansas sky on a clear October morning, which seemed right. He took it out of his breast pocket, and she held out her hand, and he put it on her finger, and then she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him, and then she stepped forward and kissed him, and it was the first time they had kissed, and it was very quiet and very certain, and it was everything he had spent the last 6 weeks working up the courage to hope for. They were married in the first week of February, 1879, in the small Methodist church on Oak Street. It was a simple ceremony. Mrs. Calloway sat in the front pew and wept openly and without embarrassment. Declan Prout was there, a broad-shouldered man of 40 with a weathered face and genuine goodwill, and he shook Walter's hand afterward with a grip that communicated approval more clearly than any speech could have. A handful of Adelaide's regular customers attended, including the woman who ran the dry goods store and the elderly German gentleman who came in every morning for a single small loaf and had, Adelaide confided, been profoundly encouraging during the difficult summer months. It was not a large wedding and it was not a grand one, but it was theirs, and it was real. And when Walter looked at Adelaide standing beside him in a dress of dark blue wool that Mrs. Calloway had helped her alter from a pattern ordered out of Wichita, with her dark hair pinned up and the small turquoise ring on her finger, he thought that he had never in his life felt so certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The question of where they would live was one they had discussed practically, and at some length during the weeks of their engagement. Adelaide's room at the boarding house was obviously not permanent, and while the bakery had a small back room that her father had used for storage, it was not livable space. Walter had his room at the lodging house, which was barely adequate for one. It was Declan Prout who provided the solution, in the way that practical men sometimes do, without fanfare or sentimentality. I have a foreman's cabin on the east end of my property that has been sitting empty since my last foreman moved on in August, he said to Walter, about 2 weeks before the wedding. It is not large, but it is solid. 2 rooms, good fireplace, a wood stove. I will let it to you at a fair rate if you stay on through the spring and take on the foreman's work proper. Walter had brought it to Adelaide that same evening, laying it out plainly, and she had listened with her usual careful attention and then asked 3 questions. Was the cabin close enough to town for her to reach the bakery each morning? Could the rent be managed alongside the bakery's operating costs? And was Declan Prout a man who kept his word? Walter answered all 3 honestly. The cabin was 2 miles from town, manageable with a horse which they would need to acquire. The rent was fair. And Declan Prout was, in his experience, exactly the kind of man who kept his word. Because he considered not keeping it to be a form of dishonesty, he was constitutionally opposed to. Adelaide nodded once and said, "Then let us do that." They moved into the cabin on their wedding night, which was both romantic and rather practical, because between the 2 of them they had accumulated enough domestic goods to fill the smaller of the 2 rooms and then some, and the process of arranging it all was accomplished with a great deal of good humor and very little ceremony. Walter built a fire while Adelaide directed the placement of her kitchen things, and by the time the fire was going well and the wood stove was lit, the small cabin had taken on the warmth of an inhabited place, of a home. They had supper that night from provisions Adelaide had prepared at the bakery, bread and cold ham, and a jar of apple preserves she had put up in the fall, and they sat at the small table in the kitchen by the fire and ate and talked and laughed, and Walter thought that this was the thing he had not known he was looking for all those years on the trail, this exact specific warmth and ease, this being with a person that felt like arriving somewhere real. Winter deepened, and they settled into it. The mornings were Walter's hardest adjustment, because Adelaide rose at 4 o'clock without fail, in the dark and the cold, and had the wood stove going before he was fully awake. He began rising with her, which was not something he had anticipated but which felt, once he started doing it, simply necessary. He would have copper saddled and ready by the time she came out with her basket and her shawl, and he would ride with her the 2 miles to town before turning east toward the Prout Ranch. "You do not have to ride with me every morning," she said, about 3 weeks into this habit. "I know," he said. "It makes your day longer," she said. "I know that too," he said. He glanced at her sideways in the early dark, their horses' hooves quiet in the frozen dirt. "But it gives me 20 minutes with you before we both go and be useful to other people, and I find I am reluctant to give that up." She looked at him, and even in the dark he could see the quality of her expression, that warmth she kept carefully banked but which broke through sometimes with a radiance that simply floored him. "All right," she said softly. "Then you may keep doing it." February became March and March became April, and the town began to wake up again as the weather eased, and the first signs of the new cattle season appeared in the form of advance riders and supply wagons, and the general quickening of a place that knew its busy season was coming. Adelaide's bakery began to see more customers. Walter had watched through the winter as she methodically worked down the debt to the Wichita flour merchant and rebuilt her supply inventory with the careful precision of someone who had learned from the mistakes of the first summer and intended not to repeat them. By March she had paid off the debt entirely, and the morning she told him at breakfast, her voice was very controlled but her eyes were bright with a relief and pride that she allowed herself to show. "That is finished," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "Paid in full." Walter reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. She looked down at their joined hands. "I hope so," she said quietly. "I think he would be. He was not a man who expected things to be easy. He was a man who expected them to be done properly." "He raised you," Walter said. "That is evidence enough." Spring brought new business and new challenges. The town grew busier, with more people passing through, more cowboys coming up from Texas with the season's herds, more commerce and noise, and the particular rough energy that Caldwell carried during the trail months. Adelaide's bakery was doing better than it ever had, partly because word had spread among the regular residents about the quality of the bread, and partly because Adelaide had expanded her offerings carefully, adding pies in the spring, and a simple fruit cake in the summer that had become unexpectedly popular. Walter's work at the Prout Ranch was demanding in the spring, the long days of calving and branding, and the management of seasonal hands who needed supervising. Declan Prout had given him genuine responsibility, and Walter had taken it on with the same steady reliability that characterized everything he did, and the two men had developed a respect for each other that ran deep and was expressed, in the manner of working men, almost entirely through action rather than words. It was on a Tuesday in late April that the first real trouble came, and it came in the form of a man named Callum Grier. Grier was a land speculator, a type that was becoming increasingly common in Kansas in those years, as the territory filled up and land values shifted, and men who knew how to read a deed and work a courtroom made more money than any cattleman. He was in his late 40s, well dressed in the manner of a man who wanted to be taken for prosperous, and he had been in Caldwell for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks he had been quietly purchasing properties. Adelaide came home on a Wednesday evening in late April with a look on her face that Walter recognized as the one she wore when she was working through something difficult and had not yet decided what to do about it. "Tell me," he said simply, when they were at the table. She told him. A man named Grier had come into the bakery that morning and had been pleasant enough at first, buying a loaf, admiring the place. And then he had informed her, in the casual way of a man who considered the matter settled before he raised it, that he had purchased the building next door and was in negotiations for the 2 properties adjacent to it, and that he was planning a development that would require the bakery building as well, and that he hoped she would consider his offer to buy her out. "He has not made a formal offer yet," Adelaide said, her voice even. "He said he wanted to give me time to think about the idea before we discussed numbers, which is another way of saying he wanted to see whether you would panic," Walter said. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is." She looked at him. "I own this building outright. My father built it on land he purchased in '70. I have the deed. He cannot take it. But he can make it very uncomfortable to operate if he buys everything around you," Walter said. "He can try," she said, and there was a quietness in her voice that was more resolute than anger. They talked about it for a long time that evening, working through what she knew of property law, what recourse she had, what the realistic options were. Walter had a practical man's knowledge of land and deed disputes from years of trail work, where ownership of grazing rights and water access was a constant source of conflict, and he laid out what he knew without exaggerating or alarming her. The next morning, Walter rode into town early, before heading to the ranch, and went to see the county recorder's office, where a meticulous clerk named Henderson kept the land records. He spent an hour examining the recorded deeds for the blocks around Elm Street and came away with a clearer picture of what Grier had and had not acquired. He reported back to Adelaide that afternoon. Grier had purchased 2 adjacent properties and was indeed in negotiations for a third, but the bakery building sat on its own separately recorded lot with clear title to Adelaide Underwood, and there was nothing in the existing deeds that would give a neighboring property owner any legal claim to it. What he can do, Walter said carefully, is make things difficult, supply access. If he owns the building to the east, he could potentially block the alley you use for deliveries. Adelaide was quiet, thinking. Then she said, "Then I need to resolve the supply access before he gets that far." She stood up and reached for her shawl. "I am going to the property office. There is a recorded easement on that alley from when my father built the bakery. I want to make sure it is in order." "Do you want me to come?" he asked. "No," she said, firmly but not unkindly. "This is my business, Walter. I know what needs to be done." He stayed where he was and watched her go and felt nothing but pride, clear and strong, without a trace of wounded feeling in it, because he had known from the first October morning who she was, and it had never been anything but the thing he admired most. The easement was in order, as it turned out, and Adelaide had a lawyer in Wichita, the same one who had handled her father's estate, confirm in writing that her rights to the alley access were legally protected. When Grier came back to the bakery the following week with a formal offer, she received him politely, listened to the number he put forward, thanked him for his time, and told him that the bakery was not for sale at any price and that her legal position was secure. He left with less grace than he had arrived with, and Adelaide told Walter about it that evening with a dry humor that surprised him into laughter. "He looked," she said, "like a man who had expected the door to open and found a wall." "What did he say?" Walter asked, grinning. "He said I would regret it," she said, which is a thing men say when they are not accustomed to being told no by women. Grier spent another 3 weeks in Caldwell and then moved on to the next town, as land speculators generally did when a deal did not materialize as planned, and the threat dissolved as quietly as it had materialized. The bakery remained Underwood's bakery. The deed remained in Adelaide's name. Summer of 1879 came in warm and golden. The cattle drives were in full swing, the town was loud and prosperous, and both Walter's work and Adelaide's were in their busiest season. They saw each other in the mornings and the evenings, and it was enough, because when you know the quality of what you are coming home to, the day's work in between becomes simply the distance between one good thing and another. In July, Adelaide told Walter that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of the cabin, on a Sunday morning when neither of them had anywhere to be, the summer light coming in warm through the small window, the smell of coffee on the stove. She said it plainly, as she said everything, watching his face with those steady eyes that were also, he could see, watching for something. Perhaps for the thing that fear looks like in a man's face when he hears news he is not prepared for. What she saw instead was Walter Hale put his coffee cup down on the table very carefully, as if it were made of something precious, and then look at her with an expression that she would later describe to Mrs. Calloway as the most completely undone she had ever seen a grown man look while being clearly, profoundly, entirely happy. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes," she said calmly, but her eyes were bright. He stood up from the table and crossed to her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then held her, carefully, as if she were something he intended to keep safe with the full force of everything he was. "Are you all right?" he asked into her hair. "I am very well," she said, and she was laughing a little, and so was he. They sat back down and talked about it for a long time, quietly, happily, making plans with the practical care that both of them brought to any significant undertaking. And when they had finished talking, Adelaide poured more coffee, and they sat in the summer morning light. And Walter thought that the life he had been living all those years on the trail had been a full life in its way. But it had been full the way a vessel is full when it holds only water, adequate for the purpose, but not aware of what it is missing. This was different. This was full in the way that a vessel is full when it holds something it was made to hold. The autumn of 1879 was a good one. Adelaide continued baking through most of her pregnancy, because she was not a woman who could be idle, and because the bakery needed her. Walter hired a young woman named Clara to help in the bakery for the fall, partly to ease the physical demands, and partly because the business had grown enough to genuinely require an extra set of hands. Clara was 19 and quick learning, and Adelaide took to teaching her the trade with the same careful thoroughness her own father had used, which pleased Walter to see, because it suggested that what her father had built was not just a building and an oven, but a way of doing things that Adelaide carried in her and was capable of passing on. The cabin had felt large enough in the winter, but as autumn deepened and Adelaide's pregnancy advanced, they both began to think about space. Walter, on his days off from the ranch, began adding a room to the east end of the cabin, a project that Declan Prout not only approved but contributed to, showing up one Saturday in September with lumber in his wagon, and spending the whole day working alongside Walter with the unceremonious helpfulness of a man who believed that neighbors and employers were not always separate categories. The room was finished by October, which gave Adelaide a month to arrange it as she wished, and arrange it she did with the same quiet competence she brought to everything: a small bed, a chest, a washstand, curtains of plain white cotton that she hemmed herself by lamplight on the evenings when the bakery was closed. Their son was born on the 8th of November, 1879, in the cabin by the Prout Ranch, delivered by the town's doctor, a sensible and capable man named Whitmore, with Mrs. Calloway in attendance because she had presented herself at the door that morning and simply stated that she was there and would not be taking up much room. Walter spent most of the labor sitting on the porch in the November cold, aware that he was not useful inside and not capable of going more than 15 feet from the door. When Dr. Whitmore came out and told him he had a son, and that Adelaide was well, Walter sat very still on the porch step for a moment, and then he went inside, and he stood in the doorway of the new room and looked at Adelaide, who was propped against the pillows with a small red-faced bundle in her arms and a look on her face that was quiet and fierce and tender all at once. And he went to her and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son for the first time, and the world, which had always seemed to him large and requiring of constant motion, settled to the size of one warm room. "Hello," Adelaide said to the baby quietly, and then looking up at Walter, "What do you think?" "I think he is the best thing I have ever seen," Walter said honestly. They named him James, for Walter's brother, which had been Adelaide's suggestion, offered one evening in October when they were discussing names, offered gently and without pressure, and which had so undone Walter that he had had to stand up and walk to the window for a minute before he could speak. When he turned back, Adelaide had simply looked at him and said nothing, because she understood, and she had always understood when words were not what was needed. James Henry Hale grew through the winter with the steady reliability of a well-made thing, and by spring, he was announcing himself to the world with considerable enthusiasm, and Walter and Adelaide navigated the particular exhaustion and hilarity of new parenthood together, with humor and patience, and the occasional moment of looking at each other across the baby's head with an expression that communicated without words that they were in this particular chaos jointly and were not sorry about it. Spring of 1880 brought changes. The cattle trail was beginning to shift as the railroads pushed further west, and Kansas itself began to close its borders to the Texas drives in response to pressure from farmers who had taken up homesteads across the old trail routes. The town of Caldwell still sat on the border and still had years of cattle traffic ahead of it, but the nature of the work was changing, and men who were paying attention could see the shape of what was coming. Walter was paying attention. He had a conversation with Declan Prout in March that was long and frank, the kind of conversation that practical men have when they have decided to be honest with each other about what they see. "This trail work has maybe 5, 6 more good years," Prout said, sitting at his own kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the directness of a man making a ledger entry. "After that, the railheads will have moved far enough west that the drives won't come through here at all. The town will change. Some of it will quiet down and some of it will turn toward farming." "What will you do?" Walter asked. "Keep ranching," Prout said, "but smaller and for local markets, not for the trail. I have been thinking about buying the section to the south and running fewer cattle, higher quality. It is a different business, but it is a future." He looked at Walter over his cup. "You have thought about this yourself." "I have," Walter said. "You are a good foreman," Prout said, "and you will be a good one for as long as you want the work. But a man with your ability and a family to consider ought to be thinking about land of his own." Walter did think about it. He thought about it for 2 weeks, and then he talked to Adelaide fully and honestly, laying out what he had been considering, what the options were, what the risks were, what the possibilities were. She listened with the focused attention she brought to any significant matter and asked questions that were sharp and practical, and that he answered as honestly as he could, including the ones where the honest answer was that he did not know yet. "There is a quarter section for sale north of town," he said. "Tom Bassett is moving his family back east, family reasons. The land has water, a creek along the south edge, and the soil looks good. I have been to see it twice." "How much?" she asked. He told her. It was not a small amount. Between their savings, which they had accumulated steadily, and what Adelaide had put away from the bakery through 2 profitable years, they had enough for a down payment, but it would be tight, and the remainder would need a mortgage. Adelaide stood up and went to her desk in the corner of the sitting room, where she kept the bakery's ledgers. She brought them to the table and opened them, and they sat together and worked through the numbers with 2 pencils and a good deal of patience, and by the end of the evening they had a clear picture of what was possible. "It is manageable," she said at last, closing the ledger. "If the bakery keeps its current trajectory, and if you can generate income from the land within the first 2 seasons, we can carry the mortgage without significant difficulty." "That is a couple of conditions," he said. "Yes," she said. "Most real things are conditional." She looked at him. "But I think you know this land. I think you know what you can do with it. And I trust your judgment about that more than I trust a column of figures." The weight of that trust settled on him, as it always did when she expressed it, not heavily but warmly, like a hand placed with full intention. They bought the land in May of 1880. It was a clear-skied day, and Walter rode out with Adelaide, James wrapped against her chest in the carrier she had made from a bolt of sturdy canvas, and they stood in the spring grass and looked at what was theirs. The creek ran clear along the south edge, catching the afternoon light. The land was flat and open in the way of Kansas, enormous sky, grass moving in the wind, the particular silence of a place that had not yet been made into anything and was waiting to be. "Well," Adelaide said, looking out across it. "Well," Walter said. James made a sound of commentary from the carrier. They both laughed. The next years were full ones. Walter built slowly and deliberately, starting with cattle because he knew cattle, and expanding into horses because he had an eye for them, and a patience that good horse management required. Adelaide kept the bakery, which continued to grow, and which she continued to run with the same careful competence that had characterized it from the beginning. Clara stayed on and became genuinely skilled, and Adelaide began to think about what it would mean to expand the operation, whether another oven was feasible, whether the demand justified the investment. The land required more of Walter's time than he had anticipated in those first seasons, which was not a complaint but a fact that required adjustment. He took on a hired hand, a quiet young man from Missouri named Eli, in the second year, which helped with the physical demands, and negotiated an arrangement with Declan Prout, where he continued to consult on the Prout cattle operation on a part-time basis in exchange for the use of certain equipment. The world of the Kansas plains in those years was a complicated one, full of competing claims and adjustments. The homesteaders were moving in across the old open range, fencing land that cattlemen had used unfenced for years, which created friction and sometimes something worse. Walter navigated this with the pragmatism of a man who had lived on both sides of a fence, who understood what the open range had meant to the trail drives, and who also understood that the people taking up homesteads were, for the most part, families trying to make a life the same as anyone else. He refused to participate in the fence-cutting that some of the cattlemen engaged in, which was a form of violence against homesteaders that he found both wrong and short-sighted. He said so plainly on the one occasion when a neighboring rancher suggested he might want to join in, and the conversation ended there, with a coldness on the other man's side that Walter accepted without regret. Adelaide heard about it from Mrs. Calloway, who seemed to hear about everything, and she came home and told him she was glad he had handled it that way, and he said that he had not supposed it would please her if he had done otherwise. In the summer of 1882, Adelaide told him she was expecting again. They were at the table having coffee, as they had been the first time, which struck them both and prompted a small shared smile at the repetition. Their second child was born in January of 1883, a girl they named Margaret, after Adelaide's mother. Margaret was a calm baby who seemed, from her first weeks of life, to have inherited her mother's quality of watchful observation, and who grew into a small girl of particular determination and particular sweetness, qualities that coexisted in her without apparent contradiction, and that reminded Walter, with a regularity that never failed to move him, of the woman who had stood in the October rain selling bread with that careful, resolute composure. James was 3 when Margaret arrived and was, after an initial period of uncertainty, deeply fond of his sister, a fondness expressed primarily through showing her things, rocks and feathers and pieces of harness, and anything else he considered interesting, with an explanatory energy that left the baby largely unimpressed but seemed to satisfy him. The bakery in those years expanded. Adelaide put in the second oven in the winter of 1883, a decision she had been considering for 2 years, and had made only when she was certain the numbers supported it. Clara was now a full partner in the operation, not in the legal sense but in the practical sense, managing the shop floor while Adelaide handled the business end, and the arrangement worked with the smoothness of a well-fitted piece of machinery. Walter's land operation was solid by 1884. The cattle herd was modest but healthy, the horse operation was developing a local reputation for quality, and the quarter section they had purchased was producing well. He had added a proper barn in 82 and a second outbuilding in 83, and the cabin itself had been added to twice more, so that what had begun as 2 rooms and a fireplace was now a proper ranch house, not grand but substantial, with a covered porch that Adelaide had planted with climbing roses that bloomed every June, and filled the air with something that Walter thought was the best smell in the world aside from fresh bread and the particular clean, cold smell of autumn mornings. The town of Caldwell changed through those years, as Declan Prout had predicted. The cattle drives diminished and eventually ended as the trails closed and the railheads moved west. The town was quieter, smaller in some respects, and some of the rougher elements moved on with the cattle trade. What remained was a more settled community, with families and farms and the infrastructure of a place that intended to persist. Underwood's bakery persisted with it and thrived. It had become, by the mid-1880s, an institution in Caldwell in the way that a thing becomes an institution not through announcement but through years of reliable presence, a place people depended on, associated with comfort and quality, and the knowledge that what they were buying was made by someone who cared about it. Mrs. Calloway, who had watched all of this from the beginning with a proprietary pride that Adelaide found both touching and occasionally overwhelming, came to the bakery every morning for a small loaf and a brief conversation that was never actually brief, but which Adelaide had long since incorporated into her morning routine as a fixed and not entirely unpleasant feature of the day. Walter turned 35 in the spring of 1885, which struck him as a number worth noticing. He spent a morning riding the fence line of his land, alone with Copper's successor, a good gray horse he had raised himself from a 2-year-old, and thinking about the shape of his life. He thought about the 15-year-old who had first gone up the trail, sure that motion itself was the point. He thought about the years of driving cattle and the particular freedom and loneliness of that life, the men he had known, the ground he had covered, the brother he had lost. He thought about October of 1878 and a woman standing in the rain with 11 loaves of bread and the kind of courage that does not announce itself. He thought about what he had now. The land, which was real and solid under his horse's feet. The house, where he would come home this evening to Adelaide, who would have been in town all day and would come in the door with flour on her apron and would pour herself a cup of water and sit down at the kitchen table and tell him about the day with the exact candor and humor and detail that he had been in love with for 7 years. James, who was 5 now and spent every possible moment in the barn demanding to be shown how things worked, with an application and curiosity that was going to take him somewhere interesting in the world, Walter was fairly sure. Margaret, 2 years old, who had recently become very committed to the project of naming every animal on the property, which had led to the discovery that there were a great many animals on a ranch, and that naming them all was a labor she undertook with cheerful persistence. He thought, this is enough, more than enough. This is the thing itself. He rode back to the barn feeling the particular contentment of a man who has taken stock, and found the ledger not only balanced but genuinely, extravagantly in the black. That evening Adelaide came home from the bakery later than usual, because there had been a delivery issue with a flour shipment from Wichita that had required correspondence in some firm language, and she was tired in the practical, resolved way of someone who has dealt with a problem and finished dealing with it. Walter had supper on the stove, a thing he had gotten competent at over the years, not at Adelaide's level by any means, but capable. She sat down at the table and he set a plate in front of her and poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her. And she looked at him with those steady brown eyes that were the same as they had always been, deep and warm and direct. "You look like a man who has been thinking," she said. "I have," he said. About how I bought 11 loaves of bread in the rain and what it led to," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her face softened in that particular way it had, the warmth coming through the careful composure like sunlight through good curtains. "I was so cold that morning," she said. "I had been standing there for an hour and not a single customer. I was starting to think I had made a very stubborn mistake. And then a cowboy rode down the street on the biggest horse I had ever seen and stopped in front of my cart," she said, "and he did not ask the price. He just counted out coins. It was good bread," he said. "It was," she agreed. "It is still good bread." She smiled then, fully the smile that still did the same thing to him that it had always done, the one that felt like sunlight. "And you are still the same man who bought it." "A little older," he said. "We both are," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the one with the turquoise ring on the finger beside it, the stone still the same color as the Kansas sky. "I think we are better for it." He turned his hand over and held hers. "Adelaide," he said. "Walter," she said. They ate supper in the warm kitchen of the house they had built, on the land they owned, in the life they had made, and it was the most ordinary evening imaginable and the most extraordinary one he could have conceived of, and he would have traded nothing of it, not a single morning or a single cold walk or a single ledger balanced at the kitchen table, for anything the wide open trail had ever offered him. The following spring brought a development that surprised them both by not surprising them very much. Clara came to Adelaide in March with the news that she was engaged to be married to a young farmer named Henry Beaumont, who had come to Caldwell from Indiana the previous year, and had been, according to Mrs. Calloway, buying bread from the bakery every single day since September in a manner that could not be explained entirely by appetite. Adelaide was genuinely pleased for Clara, and the question of what it meant for the bakery was one they addressed together, Clara and Adelaide, as the business partners they had effectively become. The answer they arrived at was that Clara would continue working through the summer, and that afterward she and Henry would stay in Caldwell, where Henry had taken a lease on 40 acres north of town, and that Clara would return to the bakery part-time after she had settled into her new life. This arrangement worked well. Adelaide spent part of that spring training a second assistant, a young woman of 17 named Polly, who was the daughter of the blacksmith and who had, Adelaide told Walter, an instinctive sense of when bread was right that was genuinely rare and worth developing. "You are building something that will last past you," Walter said one evening, watching Adelaide update the bakery's accounts at the kitchen table while the children slept. She looked up from the ledger. "That is the idea," she said simply. "My father built something that lasted past him, at least I hope it has. I intend to do the same." She looked at him steadily. "What you are building on that land will last past you too, if you do it right. James is already invested in the barn," he said. "He is 4 years old," she said, with the affectionate dryness of a mother who has navigated many small hands reaching for things they should not touch. "He has good hands," Walter said. "He is going to be good with horses." Adelaide looked at him for a moment, with the particular softness of the expression she wore when she was watching him be a father, which was an expression he had first noticed about a week after James was born, and which continued to undo him completely every single time. "He is going to be good with everything," she said. "He has good examples." The summer of 1886 was a hot one, the kind of Kansas summer that baked the earth hard and sent the creek down to a trickle by August. Walter managed the water situation with the careful attention it required, making sure the cattle had access to what remained and conserving it with a frugality that the situation demanded. Adelaide kept the bakery going through the heat, which was its own particular challenge, managing the ovens in temperatures that made the work significantly more demanding than usual. They did not complain to each other about these things, not because they suppressed complaint, but because they had established early in their life together a habit of straightforward problem-solving that left little room for unproductive misery. They identified difficulties, they addressed them, they moved forward. This was not a philosophy they had discussed or agreed upon in any formal way. It was simply what they both did, naturally and in alignment with each other, which was one of the ways in which they were deeply suited to each other without having planned to be. The drought broke in September with rains that came steadily for 2 weeks and left the creek running strong again and the grass coming back green. Walter stood on the porch the morning after the first real rain and watched the land drink it in, and felt the particular relief of a person whose livelihood is tied to the natural world in a way that makes weather personal. Adelaide came and stood beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. They stood and watched the wet grass gleam in the morning light. "Better," he said. "Much better," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they drank their coffee on the porch in the September morning, and somewhere in the barn James was already awake and talking to the horses, and Margaret would be up soon and would want to know what the rain had done to all her named animals. And the day was waiting, and the land was green again, and Walter felt, in every molecule of his being, the deep-rooted permanence of a man who has finally understood what staying means and is glad of it. Their third child came in the spring of 1888, another boy, whom they named Thomas, after Adelaide's father, which Walter had suggested. Adelaide had been quiet for a long moment when he proposed it, and then she had said yes with a steadiness that did not conceal how much it meant to her. Thomas was born in April, a loud and vigorous baby who made his opinions about the world known from his first minutes in it, and did not moderate this quality as he grew. James, 8 by then, received his new brother with the philosophical adaptability of a child who has already done this once and knows the procedure. Margaret, 5, was delighted, with the absolute thoroughness of a 5-year-old's enthusiasms, and appointed herself assistant in a range of baby-related activities with an authority that was charming and occasionally needed gentle redirecting. Life on the Hale Ranch in 1888 had a fullness to it that Walter sometimes had to simply stop and acknowledge, because it moved so fast and was so complete that there was a danger of living through it without fully registering what it was. He made himself stop regularly, in the way a man might stop on a long trail to mark where he is and take note. The land was good. The horses were doing well, and he had begun selling trained horses to ranchers and farmers across the county, which had become the most reliable part of the operation. The cattle were smaller in number than some of the earlier years but were managed well, and the arrangement with Declan Prout's operation, which had evolved over the years into a genuine partnership on certain joint ventures, remained solid and mutually beneficial. Adelaide's bakery, Underwood's Bakery, was by now the oldest continuously operating business on Elm Street, a fact that the town had noted with the quiet civic satisfaction of a community that values its landmarks. She had not changed the name when they married, a decision that Walter had understood completely and which had never been a subject of any discussion between them, because it had never needed to be. The bakery was her father's legacy and hers. The name was part of what it was. Walter came into town on a Friday afternoon in October of 1888. 10 years exactly from the 1st October, he had ridden into Caldwell, a calculation he had been aware of for weeks with the private sentimentality of a man who does not often admit to such things. He tied his horse at the post outside the bakery and went in. The bell above the door gave its familiar sound. The smell of bread and the warmth of the ovens were as much a home to him now as any physical space in his life. Adelaide was behind the counter, finishing up the last of the afternoon customers, and she glanced up when he came in with the expression that had been the constant of his life for 10 years, that look of recognition and warmth that said simply and completely, "There you are." Polly was wiping down the far counter and gave him a nod, because Polly was now 27 and had been here long enough that his presence in the bakery was entirely unremarkable. The last customer left and Adelaide came around the counter and kissed him because there was no longer any reason not to in this place or any other. "You are early," she said. "I finished the east fence line faster than I expected," he said, "and I had an errand." She looked at him. "What errand?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced 2 things. The first was a small paper package tied with string, which was a piece of marzipan from the confectioner's shop 3 doors down, which she had been fond of since they first discovered it was there. The second was a folded piece of paper. She took the marzipan first and looked at it and then at him. "What is the occasion?" 10 years, he said, "since October of '78. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said, which was the plain truth. She opened the paper package and broke off a piece of marzipan and put it in her mouth, and then she looked at the folded paper. "What is this?" "Open it," he said. She unfolded it. It was a deed, registered at the county office, for an additional 20 acres adjoining the north edge of their property, which he had purchased that morning from a farmer who had decided to move his family south. He had been watching this particular piece of land for 2 years, waiting for it to come available. Adelaide read the deed with the focused attention she brought to any document, and then she looked up at him. "You have been planning this," she said. "A while," he admitted. "This will expand the horse operation considerably," she said, thinking it through. "You could put a proper training paddock on the north section." "That was my thought," he said. She folded the deed carefully and held it. She was quiet for a moment in the warm interior of the bakery, in the smell of bread and the October afternoon light coming through the window, and Walter watched her and thought, as he sometimes allowed himself to think, that there was no view in the world he preferred to this one, this woman, this life, this place they had built. "I love you," she said. He had never gotten entirely accustomed to hearing her say it, which was one of the things he was most grateful for, that it had not become rote, that it still landed in him with the force of something true. "I love you," he said. "You and the bakery and the marzipan and the bread and all of it." She laughed, and it filled the room. "That is a very inclusive declaration." "I mean it to be," he said. They walked home that evening the way they had walked together since the beginning, side by side, easy in each other's presence with the ease that comes not from the absence of effort but from a decade of choosing each other daily. The children would be home from the school that had opened in Caldwell 3 years ago, James doing his sums with his tongue between his teeth, Margaret organizing her books with the systematic precision that had been apparent in her since she was old enough to stack things, Thomas on the floor making whatever noise or mess seemed most interesting. The ranch would need checking. The horses would need water. Eli would have the evening work mostly done, but Walter would look over it himself, because he always did. There was bread at home, because there was always bread at home, and they would have supper at the kitchen table, and the children would talk over each other, and Walter would listen to all of it with the particular listening that a man does when he is aware, constantly and gratefully, that the noise around him is the sound of everything he chose. The years settled forward into their 80s, and the town changed, and the country changed, and the Kansas plains changed with the relentless momentum of westward settlement, and the Hale Ranch grew solid and established, not grand but permanent, the kind of operation that earns respect through decades of reliable function and honest dealing. James grew into a young man of serious purpose and genuine ability with horses, and by the time he was 16, he was doing work that Walter trusted completely. He had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and a mind that combined the best of both of them in a way that made his parents proud with a regularity that they tried not to make embarrassing. Margaret at 13 was remarkable, reading everything she could get her hands on, helping in the bakery with the same instinctive competence Adelaide had shown at her age, and already making it clear to anyone paying attention that her life was going to be large and various and entirely on her own terms. Walter looked at her sometimes and thought of Adelaide standing in the rain, 19 years ago, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and not about to be defeated by something as simple as bad weather. Thomas at 5 was a force of nature, loud and warm and endlessly curious, the kind of child who filled a house completely and made everything louder and more alive. In the spring of 1893, on a clear May morning, Walter came out of the barn to find Adelaide standing on the porch with her coffee cup, looking out across the land, and he stopped for a moment just to look at her. She was 40 years old now, or would be in July, and she was more herself than she had ever been, if that was a thing that could be said, more certain of her own substance, more settled in her own life, and more beautiful to him than she had been on any of the 10,000 mornings before this one. She heard him stop and turn to look at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She shook her head slightly, the way she did when she was trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. "Come and have your coffee," she said. He went up the porch steps and took the cup she handed him and stood beside her looking out at the May morning, the grass green and the horses in the paddock moving slow and golden in the early light, the creek a distant silver thread, the sky that enormous Kansas sky that had been above him on the first morning he rode into Caldwell and had been above him on every morning since. "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" Adelaide said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about that cart," she said, "the little bread cart. I had built it myself mostly with some help from Mr. Ackerman at the hardware store because I could not afford to have it made properly. I was so pleased with it and so frightened that it would not hold up. "It held up," Walter said. "It held up," she agreed. And then a man on a very large horse stopped in front of it. "Copper was a good horse," Walter said. "He was a good horse," she said. "And you were a good man, and you bought 11 loaves of bread without asking what they cost." "I knew they were worth whatever they cost," he said. She looked at him, full and direct and warm, with those brown eyes that had been the first thing that stopped him and the last thing he thought of most nights before sleep. "So did I," she said. "About you." They stood on the porch until the children began to stir inside, Thomas's voice announcing the morning in his usual decisive manner, and the day gathered itself around them with all its reliable demands: the horses and the land and the bakery and the school and the 100 small necessary things that make up a life lived fully. They went inside to it together, as they had gone into every morning for 15 years, and the door swung shut behind them on the spring morning, and the land lay quiet and green in the Kansas sun, and the Hale ranch stood solid and real in the middle of it, the roses coming back on the porch as they came back every spring, the new paddock waiting on the North 40, the creek running clear along the south edge, everything as it should be, everything accounted for, everything loved. The bakery on Elm Street in Caldwell carried the name Underwood's for all the years that Adelaide ran it, and when she finally handed it over to Polly's capable management in her later years, she did so with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has built something that will outlast her and has meant to from the beginning. The sign was repainted twice, but the name stayed the same, because some things are worth preserving exactly as they are. Walter Hale, who had spent the first 15 years of his working life in constant motion, spent the next 45 years in one place, on one piece of land, with one woman, and found that staying was the most adventurous thing he had ever done. There was a morning many years later, when James came up from his own place with his wife and their 2 children, and Margaret came in from Wichita, where she had established herself in a business of her own, and Thomas came in from the north section of the ranch where he had built his house and was starting his own operation, and the house was full of voices and children, and the smell of the bread that Adelaide still made, smaller quantities now, but the same recipe, the same hands, the same unhurried care. Walter sat at the head of the table and looked down its length at all of it, this family that had started in a rain-soaked street with 11 loaves of bread and 2 people taking the measure of each other with the seriousness that serious things deserve. Adelaide, at the far end, caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "All right," she said. "More than all right," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with everything they were to each other steady and visible between them, across the length of the table and the years and the long, beautiful distance from that October street to this kitchen. And then she turned to answer the question one of the grandchildren was asking her. And the meal went on, and the day went on, and outside the Kansas sky was the exact color of the turquoise in the ring she still wore, and the land was still and green and theirs, and Walter Hale, who had once bought 11 loaves of bread without asking the price, had been paid back in full, 1,000 times over, in the only currency that ever truly mattered.